The land past Dry Knife Ridge never gave much mercy, and that was the way Thor Maddox liked it. Out there, where juniper roots split rock and runoff carved gullies too deep for wagons, a man could disappear. A man could let the world forget him, and he could do the same in return. Folks in Copper Run, the nearest town worth naming, had long since stopped asking why Thor lived alone on that ridge. They whispered once years ago, when the measles carried off his wife and the child she carried, and when fire finished what sickness had left behind. But whispers fade when a man does not answer them. Thor made sure silence was his only companion. Before we ride further into this tale, let me ask you, if stories of quiet resilience and Wild West love mean something to you, don't forget to press that like button, leave a comment down below telling us where you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next story left behind on these rugged frontiers. It only takes a moment, and it helps keep these campfire embers glowing bright for all who come searching for them. Thor Maddox had not spoken more than a dozen words to any soul in nearly 3 years. He measured his days not by conversation, but by the scrape of his axe, the creak of the porch chair beneath his weight, and the smell of wood smoke rolling from the chimney. 46 now, tall and rangy, his arms carried the work of fences and gates, not cattle herds. He did odd jobs in trade, fixing posts, repairing hinges, shaping pine into boards, and brought home flour, beans, or cartridges enough to last the season. He did not gamble, did not drink, and if a stranger came too near, he met them with a stare heavy enough to shut the door without saying a word. His face carried the years plain as daylight, weather-beaten skin, a faint scar running across the left cheekbone, and eyes that looked further than most men wanted to go. That scar was a relic of a cavalry skirmish from a time he didn't care to recall. Out here, memory cut deeper than any blade, and Thor bore it like he bore the wind, without complaint, without indulgence. Each evening he sat with a piece of pine in his hands, carving slow and steady. Sometimes it became a handle, sometimes a figure no one else would ever see. It wasn't for trade, not for gift, just something to keep his hands busy while the silence pressed down. That silence was the closest thing to prayer he knew. A prayer not for blessing, but for distance. And yet silence has a way of being broken when it is most determined to remain. The sound came faint at first, footsteps crunching unevenly over the hard-packed trail, too light for a horse, too heavy for deer, not steady enough for a wagon. Thor's head rose. His palm rested near the old revolver on his hip, though he did not draw. His body stiffened in the old way soldiers know, when a moment divides what was from what comes. From around the fence line, 3 figures appeared, barefoot, clothes torn, faces marked by dust and hunger. They looked like shadows forced into the open. The oldest, broad-shouldered, despite the bruises and a split lip, carried herself with a steadiness that said she'd been forced to stand tall too many times. The middle one limped, shawl sliding off her shoulder, the bruises around her collarbones speaking what her voice would not. The youngest clutched a blanket as if it were a shield, eyes wide, every glance a search for escape. Thor Maddox did not move. His jaw tightened, eyes narrowing against the weight of choice. He did not ask who they were, or what chased them. The evidence was written plain enough on their skin. He remembered those looks, the looks of women and men torn from their own, left raw by cruelty. He'd seen it after raids, after surrenders, after the world had demanded too much. The tallest raised her chin, voice rough but steady. "We need shelter, we'll work. Just a few nights." She did not beg. She did not explain. She simply stated what was needed, like a ledger marked true or false. In that instant, Thor's silence trembled, not broken, not yet, but shifted. He gave a single nod. The smallest of gestures, but to the three women, it meant the world. He opened the barn door wide. Inside, it was clean, kept ready by habit, not hospitality. Fresh straw, full water barrel, folded blankets by the bench. He had slept in that barn himself more times than he could count. That night it belonged to them. Thor sat on the porch with his shotgun laid across his thighs, eyes scanning the ridgeline. He told himself he was guarding against trouble, that he was a fool for letting strangers onto his land. Maybe men were tracking them even now. Maybe this was a trap, a lure for his trust. But the memory of their bruises gnawed at him, the limp of the middle one, the silence of the youngest, the raw steadiness of the oldest. He could not bring himself to bar the door. The first morning after, he found the tin cup cleaned and placed upside down by the basin, the water bucket refilled, the trough scrubbed, small signs of hands that did not take but gave back. He watched from the steps as the limping one, Leia, though he did not yet know her name, fed hay to the mule, sleeves rolled up, hair falling loose. She did not look at him, not then, but he knew she felt his eyes. Inside, the others worked as if work were the only shield left to them. Asha, the strong one, stacked kindling near the stove. Nomi, the youngest, sat quiet near the fence line, knees drawn up beneath her, humming faintly. That hum, low and fragile, filled the air in a way Thor hadn't heard in years. For the first time since fire and fever, the house was not quiet. It was something else, something alive. Thor Maddox had built a fortress of silence to survive his grief, but silence could not hold forever. And as the days began to shape themselves into rhythm, he felt it, the faint stirring of life daring to return, not with fanfare, but with footsteps in the yard, the sweep of a porch broom, the murmur of a girl too young to have carried so much fear. Out past Dry Knife Ridge, in a place where no one thought to look, the story of Thor Maddox was beginning again. The morning after they arrived, Thor Maddox measured the world in chores like he always had. Yet something had shifted in the rhythm. The women had left traces behind, small, deliberate signs of hands that respected the space they'd entered. The tin cup washed, set upside down on the basin, the rope coiled neat by the well, the trough scrubbed so clean it looked like new. Thor stood at the edge of the yard, the cold biting through his shirt, and he felt the unfamiliar weight of gratitude press against his ribs. He did not ask for it. He hadn't asked for anything in years. But seeing that care in the quiet tasks stirred something he thought long buried. His eyes caught on the middle woman, the one with the limp. She had stepped out into the pale light of dawn, her shawl slipping from her shoulders as she gathered hay in her arms and fed it to the mule. Her movements were slow, deliberate, the limp plain as day, but she did not falter. There was no complaint in her face, only concentration, only that steady breath between one step and the next. Thor's jaw tightened as he watched her. She should have been resting, but pride drove her forward. He knew that kind of pride. It came from refusing to be seen as weak, even when the body begged otherwise. The youngest, Nomi, was a shadow on the fence line, wrapped in a worn blanket. She hummed soft, almost too low to hear. It was not a song Thor recognized, but it worked like a bomb, filling the yard with something fragile, but living. He found himself listening for it without meaning to, his ears searching for that low, steady tune, even as his eyes moved across the ridge. Strange, he thought, how sound could remind a man that life still existed, even after years of silence. Inside, the oldest of them, Asha, was already stacking kindling beside the stove. Thor had not spoken to her, not properly, but he could see the way she carried herself, upright despite the cut on her lip, firm despite the bruises on her arms. She moved with purpose, not flinching from the house as if daring it to reject her. He respected that, though he did not say it. Words had become expensive to him, and he spent them sparingly. That evening, he left food on the porch: smoked meat, a can of beans, a small pouch of coffee grounds. He did not wait to see if they would take it. He just set it there and walked back to the south fence, letting the work occupy his hands. By the time he returned, the food was gone, the plate cleaned and left exactly where he had placed it. Such a simple thing, but to Thor it meant agreement, a silent understanding. They were not here to steal. They were not here to demand. They were simply asking for a place to draw breath without being hunted. On the fourth day, Thor found himself standing by the woodpile, watching them again. He told himself it was caution, that he needed to keep an eye on strangers who might bring trouble down from the ridge. But deep down, he knew it was something else. He was measuring how they fit into the land, into the rhythm of his days. And the truth unsettled him. They were beginning to belong, not by invitation, but by effort. That afternoon, Leia, he did not know her name yet, stood barefoot in the hard soil, sleeves rolled, feeding the mule with her bare hands. The animal took to her without complaint. Thor stepped out from the porch, boots crunching on gravel, his voice, unused and rough, carried across the yard. "You don't have to feed it," he said. She turned, hesitated, and then answered without looking him in the eye. "It likes me." Those 3 words lodged deep in him. They weren't about the mule alone. She was saying more, testing the air between them. And he felt it in his bones. He did not argue. He just set the bucket down and rubbed the scar along his jaw, the old familiar gesture when his thoughts grew heavy. The air smelled of hay and ash. In that silence, a truth formed that he could not deny. Their presence no longer felt temporary. When Asha finally spoke of their past, the words came flat and raw. They had been taken from a camp near the Verde, tied and brutalized by men who claimed to trade food. They had slipped away in the dark, hungry, broken, and carrying nothing but themselves. Thor listened without interruption, his stomach tightening as anger coiled inside him. He had seen enough in war to know the shape of such cruelty. He did not ask for details. He did not need them. The bruises, the limp, the fear in Nomi's eyes, all of it already told the story. "We just need a place until it's safe to move on," Asha said, her voice hard as the ridge itself. Thor met her gaze and gave a single nod. He knew then that he would not send them away. It was not a decision weighed on words or logic. It was instinct, born of a man who had once known loss and could not look at 3 wounded souls and turn his back. That evening, he left a folded quilt and a set of old clothes on the kitchen table. They were his wife's things, packed away in a chest he had not touched since the winter she died. He did not explain, did not tell them what they meant. He simply left them there and closed the door behind him. And when he returned, the quilt was spread, the clothes gone, and a pot of beans simmered on the stove. The floor had been swept, a plate weighted with hot cornbread and boiled eggs. Thor stood in the doorway, the smell of beans filling the air, and for the first time in years, he felt the house breathe, not with memory, not with loss, but with life. He did not smile, not outwardly, but inside a long frozen place cracked. That night, as he sat on the porch again with his shotgun across his lap, he realized silence no longer pressed on him, like a sentence. It mingled with the sound of humming, of footsteps in the loft, of a fire tended by hands that were not his. And Thor Maddox, who had spent 3 years alone, felt the weight of company settle on him, not as a burden, but as the first fragile sign of belonging. The house smelled of beans and wood smoke, and for the first time in near a decade, Thor Maddox felt something close to peace, pressing at the edges of his silence. Yet it was not stillness that followed, it was rhythm. Work began to braid itself through each day, not by order or command, but by instinct born of survival. The women took to the chores without waiting for his word, and Thor, though wary, could not help but notice how the weight on his shoulders seemed to ease in quiet increments. At first it startled him. He was used to carrying every burden himself, splitting wood until his arms ached, mucking the barn alone, drawing water until the rope bit into his palms. But on those mornings after their arrival, he found the ash pan emptied before he stepped to the stove, the barn swept clean of manure, and the trough filled full enough for the mule to drink its fill. These were not the careless gestures of guests waiting for hospitality. They were the deliberate motions of women who had learned that work was the only shield left between themselves and the world's cruelty. Leia's limp slowed her, but it did not stop her. Thor watched her one morning as she carried 2 buckets of water across the yard, both hands straining, shoulders tight. He moved toward her out of habit, ready to take the load, but before his hand reached the handle, she snapped her eyes up at him, firm and unflinching. "I can," she said, voice rough but steady. For a moment he froze, his fingers brushing the wood of the bucket. Then he let go. Something shifted between them in that pause. Not trust, not yet, but recognition, an understanding that her strength was not to be stolen by pity. Thor felt a flicker of respect ignite, and with it came an ache he hadn't allowed himself in years, the ache of remembering what it was like to share the burden of work with another. Asha was harder to read. She carried herself like a soldier, her eyes sharp, as if weighing every angle of the house and yard. Thor noticed her inspecting the pantry shelves, her fingers testing the walls for weak spots, her gaze drifting toward the rifle that hung above the door. When she asked if there was a spare she could use for hunting, her tone was flat, practical. Thor told her there was. She said nothing more, but from that day forward she stacked firewood higher, cut kindling in neat bundles, and made sure the rifle rested within reach whenever he rode out. Thor read it for what it was, not mistrust of him, but defense against the world that had already taken too much. The youngest, Nomi, moved like a ghost at first, silent except for the low hum that seemed to follow her from chore to chore. She swept the barn twice each day, brushed down the mule with careful strokes, and sometimes sat at the porch table, sorting beans into small, neat piles, as though each piece must have its place. She flinched at loud noises, at the crack of a branch underfoot, or the sudden call of a crow. But she did not flinch at Thor, not anymore. The change came slow, but he saw it, her wide eyes beginning to settle, her small hands no longer clutching the blanket quite so tight. Thor, who had long measured his days in silence, began to measure them differently now. He counted not the hours, but the signs of their presence, the faint hum drifting from the yard, the smell of stew simmering when he returned from the ridge, the sweep marks across the porch floor. At first, these things unsettled him. They reminded him of what he had lost, of the years when another woman's hands had tended this home. Yet as days folded into one another, he began to find comfort in them. The silence that once pressed heavy as a coffin now carried a pulse, alive with the sound of movement, of breathing, of simple life being lived. On the third evening, Thor stood at the woodpile, axe in hand, and caught himself watching them move through the yard. There was no reason for it, no suspicion, only a pull he could not name. Asha carried in 2 rabbits she had trapped, her sleeves rolled to her elbows, skirt muddy to the knees. Leia crouched by the small patch of vegetables he had half abandoned, her braids swinging as she weeded between rows. Nomi sat on the porch steps, humming, her head tilted to the setting sun. Thor set the axe down slowly and leaned on the handle, his breath deep and unsteady. They did not belong to him, and he did not belong to them. Yet something in the air whispered that belonging might be growing anyway, without permission, without words. That night they shared a meal together for the first time. 4 plates, 1 pot of rabbit stew, the smell of garlic and smoke filling the cabin. There was no ceremony, no declaration. They ate because the food was hot, and the day had been long. But when Nomi whispered, "Thank you," her small voice carrying across the table, Thor felt the sound land heavier than any rifle shot he'd ever heard. Leia's eyes rested on his hands more than his face, and Asha, though quiet, leaned back in her chair with something close to ease. For Thor, who had spent 10 years measuring life in grief, the moment struck like a thunderclap. He was no longer eating alone. Later, when the dishes had been cleared and the house dimmed to lamplight, Leia lingered in the kitchen. Thor fed another split log to the stove, his back to her, but he heard the faint scrape of a plate being set aside. "You married long?" she asked quietly. The question startled him more than gunfire would have. His hand froze on the stove handle. He turned slow, eyes catching hers. 8 years, he answered. "Did you love her?" she asked, her voice softer, more dangerous. Thor swallowed hard. "Yes." Leia did not cry. She did not press further. She only nodded. And in her eyes, Thor saw not pity, but kinship. 2 souls carrying loss too heavy to put into words. That night, as he sat again on the porch with the shotgun laid across his knees, he realized the truth that had been growing since the first day. These women were not a burden, not intruders, not strangers to be shut away. They were workers, survivors, breath still moving in bodies that refused to die. And Thor Maddox, a man who had walled himself in silence, felt the walls give just enough to let them remain. The fire had burned low that night, the coals pulsing red against the iron belly of the stove. And Thor Maddox sat in his chair, arms folded tight, watching the last light sink through the cracks. The questions Leia had asked still echoed inside him. 8 years, did you love her? Yes. The words had come rough, like stones dragged across his throat. He had spoken truth, but the truth did not empty the weight. Instead, it pressed heavier, pulling his mind back to winters past, to the fever that took both wife and child, to the silence that followed like a grave marker no one could move. He thought he had buried that silence deep enough. Yet, with 3 women under his roof, it had risen again, not as punishment now, but as reminder. When dawn broke, the world outside looked unchanged. The ridge standing sharp, the wind sweeping dry across the juniper. The soil cracked and stubborn. But inside the cabin, the rhythm had settled into something almost like life. He heard the scrape of a broom against the porch before his boots touched the floor, the faint hum of Nomi drifting from the barn, and the firm thud of Asha stacking wood near the stove. These sounds, ordinary as they were, held more weight than sermons. They said the house was not empty anymore. They said the silence had competition. That morning Thor stepped into the yard, rifle balanced in the crook of his arm. He spotted Leia crouched by the mule's pen, adjusting the binding on her ankle with fingers that trembled only slightly. She looked up, hair tumbling loose around her shoulders, eyes dark but steady. For a moment their gazes held, neither flinching, neither looking away. Then she turned back to the mule, stroking its flank with the slow rhythm of someone willing herself to keep moving. Thor felt a tug in his chest. Not pity, not desire, but something harder to name, a pull towards someone who refused to surrender, even when the body asked her to. It was later that day when Asha finally laid the truth bare. They were not runaways, she said, her voice low and sharp, but taken. Men who rode under the name of Reich had come to their camp with the lie of trade, tying up the men, leaving them bound, and then taking what they hungered for. The women had slipped away, drunk on fear and desperation, crossing creeks and ridges with nothing but their bruises and each other. Thor stood in the doorway. While she spoke, his hands curled into fists so tight. The scar on his cheek burned with the memory of old battles. He did not ask her to explain what took what they wanted meant. He had no need. The bruises, the torn fabric, the way Nomi clung to her sister like a child drowning in dark water. These things told the story loud enough. His jaw worked hard before he finally answered. "You're not leaving." The words were simple, spoken flat, but they carried the weight of a man who had decided. Asha narrowed her eyes, her chin lifting like a woman used to fighting. "We don't mean to bring trouble to your door." Thor shook his head once, his voice low. "Trouble's already here. You're not facing it alone." That evening he carried a quilt from the chest at the foot of his bed, one stitched by his wife's hands long ago. He laid it across the kitchen table with a folded dress and a pair of worn boots beside it. He said nothing of where they came from, nothing of what it cost him to lay them out. He only turned and walked outside, leaving the door open behind him. When he returned later, the quilt was gone, the boots taken, and a pot of beans simmered on the stove. The floor was swept clean, the fire banked, and a plate of cornbread rested waiting on the table. The air carried not grief but presence. Thor sat at the table that night, his eyes on the fire, and for the first time in years he ate with company. They did not speak much. Just the clatter of spoons, the scrape of bowls, the soft murmur of Nomi's voice as she whispered thanks. Yet for Thor, it felt like thunder rolling across dry land. His heart beat hard against his ribs, not with fear, but with something near to longing. He had not asked for this. He had not prepared, but it had come, and it was changing him. When the dishes were cleared, Leia lingered by the stove. Her hand trembled slightly as she set down her plate, but her eyes did not waver when she looked at him. "She die here in the house?" and she asked, voice barely above a whisper. Thor kept his gaze on the fire. "No, in town." Measles took her and the baby's silence stretched long enough to break bones. Then Leia said, "I'm sorry." The words landed soft, but inside Thor, they cracked something open. He nodded once, unable to give more. Later, long after the fire dimmed, Leia stepped out onto the porch where Thor sat with his shotgun across his knees. She moved quiet, wrapped in the shawl he had given her, hair loose against the wind. She did not speak at first, only lowered herself to the steps beside him, leaving space but not distance. After a long silence, she whispered, "Why'd you let us stay?" Thor's breath came deep and slow. He thought of the bruises, the silence, the way no one else would take them. "Didn't seem right to send you off," he said. She nodded, her eyes fixed on the stars. "Some folks would have." Thor's reply came steady. "I ain't some folks." Thy da. Porch held them both, two shadows against the dark, neither asking for more, neither running anymore. Thor felt the weight of the shotgun ease across his thighs, and for the first time since fire and fever had hollowed him, he understood that silence could be shared. It did not have to be endured alone. And in that moment, with Leia breathing steady beside him, he felt something stir deep within, a reminder that even a man carved hollow by loss could still hold the beginnings of a new life. The night had passed in silence, but it was not the empty kind Thor Maddox had carried for years. It was the kind that came when words were not needed, when the crackle of fire and the steady breathing of another soul nearby were enough to remind him he was no longer alone. Leia had sat beside him on the porch, shawl wrapped close, eyes lifted toward the stars. Her question still lingered in his ears. "Why'd you let us stay?" He had answered in the only way he knew, plain and stripped of decoration. "It didn't seem right to send you off." The truth of it settled heavier than any oath, and when she nodded, when she accepted it without pressing further, something inside Thor steadied. By morning, the rhythm of survival carried them forward. The sound of sweeping came first. The porch steps brushed clear of dust and pine needles. Then, the scrape of kindling stacked by the stove. Nomi's soft hum drifted from the barn. That same low tune she always clung to, fragile yet constant. Thor rose from bed and washed over the basin, catching his reflection in the wavering water. The scar across his cheek looked deeper than he remembered, the gray in his beard more pronounced. He studied himself for a long while, wondering how such a weathered face could be the one those women looked toward for safety. He shook the thought away and stepped outside. Leia was crouched by the vegetable patch, sleeves rolled high, braid falling over her shoulder. She moved carefully, her limp still noticeable. But she dug her hands into the soil with purpose, pulling weeds, loosening earth that had lain stubborn all summer. She glanced up when she heard his boots on gravel, and for the first time she didn't look away. Her eyes, dark and steady, met his full on. You ever had beans grow this slow before?" she asked. Thor scratched at his beard, his voice rough from disuse. "They're late. Frost came early. Won't see much till October." She wiped sweat from her brow with the back of her wrist and gave a faint smile. "Feels good to do something real." Thor nodded. "Hard work keeps the noise down." Her gaze held his. "There's a lot of noise in me," she said, and though the words were simple, they carried a weight he knew too well. Thor didn't answer. He didn't need to. He understood what it meant to carry noise so loud. Inside, it drowned out the world. That afternoon, as the sun dropped behind the ridge, a rider appeared. Thor spotted the dust cloud first, slow moving along the north rim trail. He stepped back into the house, lifted the Winchester from the wall, and loaded it with practiced calm. He watched from the rear window as the rider crested the far ridge, and scanned the land below and lingered too long. Thor's breath slowed, eyes fixed on every movement. After a long wait, the rider turned back and disappeared the way he had come. At supper, Thor told them, Asha's back straightened, her eyes narrowing. "You see his face?" she asked. "No," Thor said. "He didn't come close. Could be one of Reich's men." "Could," Thor agreed. Asha leaned back against the wall, her jaw tight. "We should leave before dark." Thor set his spoon down, gaze heavy. "You're not going anywhere." Her eyes flared, defiant. "You said it yourself." "They're still looking." "Running now won't help," Thor replied, voice flat but steady. "You got food here. You got walls. You got someone will shoot back if it comes to that." Asha studied him, lips pressed thin. She didn't argue further, though her silence carried its own sharpness. Thor held her gaze until she looked away, then returned to his stew. The decision was made. Later that night, when the dishes were done and the cabin had quieted, Leia lingered again. Nomi had gone to bed early, curled under the quilt with her blanket clutched tight. Asha stood outside under the stars, watching the tree line with the rifle near her hand. Leia came to the doorway, where Thor sat oiling the Winchester. Her shawl hung loose over her shoulders, her bare feet whispering against the floorboards. She folded her arms under her chest and leaned against the frame. "Why are you helping us?" she asked, her voice low but unwavering. Thor looked up, at his eyes catching the lamplight. "You didn't do anything to deserve what was done to you," he said. "That's enough." Leia stepped closer, her eyes searching his face. "I wasn't touched," she admitted quietly. "Not like Asha was. Not like they tried with Nomi. They came for me too, but I ran. I just kept running." Thor set the rifle down, his gaze steady. "Don't matter whether they got close or not. You carry it just the same." Her breath caught, and she looked at his hands, rough and scarred from years of labor. Slowly, hesitantly, she laid her smaller hand over his. "I know you carry things too," she whispered. They sat in silence, the weight of unspoken things settling between them. Then, almost without thought, Leia leaned her head against his shoulder. Just once, just long enough for Thor to feel the warmth of her breath, the truth of her nearness. He did not pull away. He did not move at all. He simply let the silence hold them both. By the seventh day, the cabin no longer felt like a place of strangers. The mornings carried their own rhythm. Asha's purposeful footsteps across the porch, the scrape of wood stacked against the wall, Nomi's hum like a low thread stitching the air together. Leia moved easier now, her limp less severe, her shoulders stronger. She worked the soil with patience, washed clothes in the basin, mended seams with thick gray thread. The sound of life filled every corner, the creak of chairs, the rustle of skirts, the crack of kindling. Thor found himself listening not for silence, but for these things. They marked the hours better than a clock ever could. He no longer wondered when they would leave. He no longer thought of them as guests, as they had woven themselves into his days, and though no words declared it, they belonged. And for Thor Maddox, a man who had lived too long with ghosts, this quiet, shared rhythm was more than company. It was the first fragile piece of a new foundation, built not of promises or declarations, but of work, presence, and the simple act of staying. By the end of that seventh day, the house had taken on a rhythm, steady enough to fool even Thor Maddox into thinking it might last. Yet peace on the frontier never holds long before someone tries to claim it. Thor knew it in his bones, the way a man who's fought before always knows when battle stirs on the horizon. He'd felt it in the rider's eyes, the slow circle on the ridge. Trouble wasn't gone, it was waiting, and when it came, it would come for the women under his roof. The morning carried on as if nothing pressed in from the outside. Leia knelt in the vegetable patch, sleeves rolled up, soil clinging to her hands. Asha moved like a sentry, circling the fence line with Thor's old Winchester slung across her back, her eyes never still. Nomi sat by the porch rail, a book open across her lap, stumbling over letters while humming the same low tune. To any passerby, it might have looked like a family, strange stitched together, but a family all the same. Thor felt it settle in him, heavier each day, and the weight brought both comfort and fear. Comfort, because it gave him something worth guarding. Fear, because it meant he had something to lose again. That evening, as dusk settled across the ridge, hoofbeats carried through the wind. Not just one horse this time, 4. Thor stepped onto the porch, rifle already loaded and resting steady in his hands. Behind him, the door closed softly, Leia drawing Nomi inside, her movements quick but quiet. Asha stepped forward instead of back, the Winchester raised, her eyes narrow but sure. Thor's chest tightened at the sight. They were not running anymore. They were standing. The riders stopped at the fence line, shadows against the fading light. One dismounted, broad-shouldered, with a well-kept beard and a coat too clean for honest labor. His voice carried smooth as riverstone. "Evening, name's Reich. I'm here for what belongs to me." Thor didn't answer at first. He let silence work, heavy and steady. Reich chuckled low, mistaking it for hesitation. 3 scores, one tall and loud, one with a limp, one too young to be anywhere but under my roof. They took off near a month back. Contract's mine, got papers say so. There's a bounty on 'em all. Thor lifted the rifle slow, deliberate, until the barrel fixed steady on the man's chest. His voice came low, gravel rough but sure. They belong to no one. "And there's no bounty for married women?" Reich's brows rose. "You married one?" Thor's jaw clenched. "She took my name." The silence that followed was thick as tar. Behind Thor, Asha stepped forward, her voice sharp as a knife's edge. "You've got 2 minutes to turn around." "I suggest you use both." Reich's eyes narrowed, studying her. "Always had a mouth, didn't you? And I'll still have one when you're gone." The other riders shifted uneasily, glancing toward the dark windows of the cabin, the fence posts lined clean, the steady hands holding rifles with no tremor. Thor's stance did not falter. He had seen enough fights to know when a man was bluffing and when he wasn't. He wasn't bluffing tonight. "You gonna start a war over women, Maddox?" Reich sneered. Thor's voice dropped even lower. "I already did. Long time ago. This time I'll finish it faster." For a moment the only sound was the wind pulling through the juniper. Then Reich spat in the dirt. "Not worth the lead." He swung onto his horse, muttering as he turned. "Let him rot out. Here." One by one, the riders followed, their silhouettes shrinking against the ridge until the hoofbeats faded into nothing. Thor stood still until the night was quiet again. Only then did he lower the rifle. Behind him, the cabin door opened, and Leia stepped out, her eyes wide, her breath trembling. "They're gone?" she asked. He nodded once. She stepped forward, wrapping her arms tight around his waist, pressing her face into his chest. "Elm, why'd you do it?" she whispered. Thor's hand rested heavy on her back. His voice came simple. "Because you're mine now." She didn't argue, didn't flinch at the claim. She only held on tighter. And in that moment, Thor felt the truth of it. They were his to guard now, not as property, not as possession, but as family chosen in the fire of survival. The days that followed passed quieter than any of them expected. Reich did not return. No more riders came down the trail. Yet the air carried tension, the kind that lingers after lightning, even when the storm has passed. Thor kept to his routines, but each ride along the ridge carried sharper eyes, each cleaning of his rifles slower and more deliberate. The women felt it too, though none spoke of it. Asha checked the traps twice a day, always with the Winchester across her back. Leia tended the vegetables and cooked, but she moved with a steadiness now, no longer glancing over her shoulder at every shadow. Nomi, for the first time, began to speak in full sentences again, her voice soft but sure as she read words aloud by the firelight. Thor noticed something shift within himself as well. He no longer listened for silence. He listened for their sounds, the sweep of a broom, the hum of a girl, the laughter that sometimes flickered, soft between the sisters. He caught himself waiting for it, needing it. Where once silence had been his shield, now it felt like emptiness he no longer wanted to carry. One morning, as the frost clung thick to the ground, Leia brought him coffee out by the fence. She handed him the tin cup, her eyes catching his. "You always been alone since her?" she asked. "Mostly," he said. "Folks long gone." She sipped slow, then rested her hand on the rail, her fingers brushing his. She didn't pull away, and neither did he. Her voice softened. "We never had a place. Camp to camp, army moving us twice, then Reich. This place, it's the first time I've ever slept without dreaming of running." Thor swallowed hard, his gaze drifting over the land he had built with another woman years ago. "Don't know how to leave it behind," he said. "Built it with her." Every board, every gate, Leia nodded, her hand still near his. "Maybe it ain't about leaving. Maybe it's about who you let stay." Thor felt the weight of her words settle deep. For years he had carried silence as his only companion. Now, standing there, with her fingers brushing his, he realized silence was no longer what he needed. What he needed was this, the sound of life moving steady beside him. The ridge lay quiet after Reich rode off, but Thor Maddox knew quiet could be as dangerous as thunder. It was the stillness before another storm, the kind that lulled a man into lowering his guard. He would not make that mistake. Still, even with his eyes on the horizon, he could not deny what had changed inside the cabin. For the first time in years, his house no longer felt like a monument to loss. It was becoming a home again, not through words or vows, but through the rhythm of shared living, supper at a crowded table, the sound of Leia's soft humming as she worked the stove, Nomi's hesitant laughter breaking through at odd moments. Even Asha, always sharp-edged, had started to move through the rooms with something less like suspicion and more like presence. Leia was the one who changed the most before Thor's eyes. Where once she walked with her head down, shoulders folded, she now carried herself straighter, steadier. The limp still marked her steps, but it no longer bent her spirit. She tended the garden with a quiet determination, her sleeves rolled high, her braids swinging down her back. Thor caught himself watching her more often than he meant to. The way her hands moved through soil, the way her chest rose steady with each breath, the way she no longer looked away when his eyes met hers. The truth pressed at him harder each day. She was not passing through. She was rooting herself into the land, into his life. And he was letting her. At night, she shared his bed without hesitation, slipping through the door after the others had gone quiet. There were no declarations, no flowery speeches. She simply came, bare feet whispering across the floorboards, eyes meeting his in the low lamplight, and Thor rose to meet her without question. Their touches were not desperate, but deliberate, born of two people who had carried too much for too long, and were finally allowed to set the burden down together. In the mornings, she remained curled against him, her hand resting over his chest as if she had every right to be there. Thor, who had once thought himself unworthy of such closeness again, let himself believe she did. Asha noticed, of course. Her eyes caught everything. She said nothing, but the way she stacked wood, the way she positioned herself near the door with the rifle ready, told Thor she had made peace with it. He suspected she had measured him, tested his edges, and found that his claim was not ownership, but protection. Nomi, for her part, seemed lighter now. She no longer flinched every time hoofbeats echoed from the ridge. She brushed the mule with patience, fed the chickens without being asked, and read slowly from the battered book Leia guided her through by firelight. The girl's voice, halting but sure, was proof enough for Thor that survival was turning into something more. Still, he did not let down his guard. Each day he rode the perimeter, eyes scanning the horizon. Rifles always kept cleaned and ready. But one evening, as the sun bled red across the sky, he returned to find Leia waiting by the fence. She wore one of his old flannel shirts over her dress, sleeves rolled up, a belt tied at her waist. She leaned against the post, her braid loose, her face soft with weariness. "You ever think we'd come to a place like this?" she asked. Thor set down his rifle, his gaze steady. "Didn't think much about anything before you three showed up." Her lips curved faintly. "You regret it?" He shook his head. "Not a moment." She nudged his arm with her elbow, a gesture so small but so daring it surprised him. "I was worried you'd be cold in the mornings." "I've been cold for 10 years, he said. She smiled then, and the sight of it struck him harder than any bullet could. "Not anymore," she whispered. It was true. For years, his mornings had been measured in frostbitten silence, or in coffee boiled bitter over an empty stove, in wind-rattling shutters without answer. Now his mornings carried the sound of Leia's voice, the scrape of Nomi's chair across the floor, the sure rhythm of Asha's boots moving through the yard. The cold still came, but it no longer reached him. Winter pressed closer each day. Frost clung longer to the soil. The wind carried sharper edges, and the mule's breath turned to mist at dawn. Thor prepared the house with practiced hands, patching leaks in the roof, splitting wood until the stacks rose taller than the porch rail, salting down meat in the cellar. Yet this year felt different. The work was not done alone. Asha carried logs as if she had been born to it, her shoulders set like stone. Leia canned what vegetables they had managed to grow, her movements steady, her hair falling loose around her cheeks. Nomi gathered herbs with careful hands, her hum soft as ever, but now carrying a faint note of hope. One evening, Leia stood by the stove, her hand resting unconsciously on her stomach. Thor watched her from the rocker, boots off, coffee cup in hand. She turned and caught his gaze, her eyes wet but steady. "I think it's real," she said softly. Thor set the cup aside and rose, his steps slow but sure. He placed his hand over hers, covering the small rise of her belly. His throat tightened. "Then it's ours," he said. She nodded, her breath trembling. "I never thought I'd feel safe enough to hope for this again." Thor swallowed hard, his voice low. I never thought I'd deserve it again. They stood there together, the fire crackling low, the air heavy with truth. For a long while, neither spoke. They didn't need to. The future had already begun to take shape in the quiet warmth between them. Yet that night, as snow threatened on the horizon and the wind rattled the shutters, Thor lay awake with Leia pressed against him. He listened not for silence, but for her steady breathing, for the faint hum of Nomi in the loft, for the creak of the porch boards where Asha made her late rounds. These sounds were his shield now, stronger than any rifle. They were the proof that his home was no longer built from grief alone. It was being built again, through trust, through work, through the quiet choice to stay. And as sleep finally claimed him, Thor Maddox, once a man hollowed by loss, understood that he was no longer alone. The house, the ridge, the silence itself had changed. He had let them in, and in return, they had given him something he thought forever lost, a reason to wake each morning, and the promise that even on the harshest frontier, life could begin again. Winter's first breath had settled on the ridge, sharp enough to sting the skin and turn water to glass before morning. Thor Maddox woke to the sound of Leia's steady breathing beside him, her hand resting warm against his chest, her belly carrying the faintest whisper of what might come. For a long moment he simply lay still, listening. Not for silence, the old habit of a man alone, but for life. The scrape of Asha's boots across the porch, Nomi's soft hum from the loft above, the faint creak of wind through the eaves. These were the new measures of his world, and though danger still pressed close beyond the hills, he found himself clinging to them as though they were rope keeping him steady on a ledge. The memory of Reich's visit hadn't faded. Thor could still see him clear. The sharp beard, the papers waved like weapons, the way his words carried poison dressed as law. They belong to me, Reich had said. And Thor had answered with iron in his voice. They belong to no one, and there's no bounty for married women. That truth had driven the man off, but Thor knew men like Reich didn't vanish with a single refusal. They bided, they schemed, they waited for weakness. It was why Thor checked the ridge twice each day, Winchester slung across his back, eyes sharp against the horizon. Asha often walked with him, her steps sure, her gaze unyielding. She did not waste words, but Thor could feel the weight of her presence like another line of defense. She was sharpening, not softening. And though the bruises had faded from her skin, the fire in her eyes burned hotter. He respected it, even admired it, though he would never put such thoughts into words. Nomi, by contrast, had begun to unfurl like a flower in thawing ground. Her voice, once trapped in whispers, now carried more freely, hesitant sentences at first, then full thoughts as she fed the mule or brushed down the chickens. She had taken to sitting near Thor's workbench in the evenings, watching as he mended tools or shaped hinges. She asked no questions, but her nearness told him all he needed. She trusted him. For a girl so young, whose world had been nothing but betrayal, it was no small gift. Thor found himself guarding it fiercely. And Leia was no longer simply surviving. She moved through the cabin with purpose, her limp still present but less pronounced, her shoulders held firm. She slept in Thor's bed each night now without hesitation, her clothes folded beside his, her hands busy at the stove or mending seams, her laughter rare but real. Thor, who had once thought his heart carved hollow by grief, felt it stir each time her eyes found his. She had become part of his days, not a shadow passing through. Yet the world beyond the ridge had not forgotten them. One morning, as Thor split wood near the barn, Tom Belden from Copper Run rode up the trail. His face carried the weight of bad news even before he spoke. He handed Thor a folded flyer, the ink crude, but the sketches unmistakable. Asha's angular face, Nomi's wide eyes, Leia's neckline drawn lower than it truly was. Beneath the images read the words, fugitives, property stolen from contract, reward upon return. Thor folded the paper slow, jaw tightening. Tom cleared his throat. Reich's stirring noise in town. Claims he paid for them. Says the law won't meddle unless it crosses town limits. Thor nodded once. He didn't trust himself to speak more. Tom tipped his hat, worry etched deep in his eyes. You sure you know what you're doing, Maddox? I do, Thor said, voice flat. That night, he laid the flyer on the kitchen table. The women gathered around, the lamplight catching on their faces. Nomi's breath caught, her eyes wide. He found us, she whispered. Thor shook his head. Not yet. Asha's fists clenched. He will. Leia stepped forward, her eyes scanning the sketch of herself, the false lines. That made her more spectacle than woman. You didn't ask for us, she said, her voice trembling with anger. I didn't ask for trouble either, Thor answered, his voice low but steady. But it came. And you're still here. That means something. His eyes found Leia's, holding her steady. I can make it legal. Papers. If I marry one of you, no man can claim you. Not even Reich. Asha stiffened, suspicion flaring in her gaze. That's not what we want. Well, I'm not offering it as a bargain, Thor said firmly. You don't owe me a damn thing. But it's what I can do, and I won't do it unless one of you says it yourself. The silence that followed was thick as the winter wind. Then Leia stepped closer, her voice quiet, but sure. I'll take your name. Asha's eyes widened, but she said nothing. Nomi looked between them, fear and relief warring in her face. Leia moved to Thor's side, her chin lifted. I'm not doing it to hide. No, I'm doing it because I feel safe here. Because you didn't ask for anything. Because you stayed. Thor's chest rose once, heavy with the weight of her words. He nodded slow. Then we go tomorrow. The decision was made with no ceremony, no fanfare. Yet for Thor, it carried more than survival. It carried meaning he hadn't let himself want in a long time. The chance to build, not just endure. That night, Leia lingered by the window, brushing her hair in the lamplight. Thor watched her from the rocker, the flyer folded in his coat pocket. She turned, eyes soft but steady. You don't look at me like I'm broken, she whispered. You're not, he said simply. I thought I was. You're not, he repeated, his voice iron steady. She crossed the room barefoot, the floorboards creaking beneath her steps, and sat beside him. I didn't want to need anyone, she said, her forehead resting against his shoulder. Needing ain't weakness, Thor replied, his hand resting on hers. Staying's harder than running. She nodded, her breath warm against his neck. And in that moment, Thor Maddox understood. Tomorrow's papers would not only shield her from a false claim, they would bind his life to hers, not by law alone, but by choice. And choice, in a land where so much was stolen, was the rarest gift of all. The next morning dawned cold and sharp, frost crawling white across the fence rails, breath of mule and man rising like smoke in the brittle air. Thor Maddox saddled the bay before first light, hands moving by habit, mind heavy with the choice made the night before. Leia had said she would take his name, and now the weight of it pressed against his chest like armor and burdened both. He hadn't thought he would stand in a courthouse again, hadn't thought he would write his name alongside another's, but the world had a way of circling back on itself, carving new paths through old scars. Leia came down the steps wrapped in the shawl she'd worn that first night. Clean now, mended along the seams, though still plain. Her dark braid hung over one shoulder, and her limp carried her steady to the yard. She didn't speak as she mounted behind him, her hands resting lightly on the saddle horn. She didn't need to. The choice had already been made. Behind them, Asha stood on the porch, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Nomi hugged the worn blanket tight around her shoulders, her wide eyes following them until the ridge swallowed their figures. Copper Run lay 3 ridges over, 3 streets wide and dust-choked, with a half-built church tower that cast a shadow longer than the lawmen cared to walk. As Thor reined the horse down the main street, faces turned, whispers stirring like brush fire. He ignored them. Leia sat straight behind him, her chin lifted, her gaze forward. She would not bow her head today. Inside the courthouse, the air smelled of ink, paper, and stale tobacco. Judge Conincade squinted over his spectacles when Thor stepped through the door. "Maddox?" he said, voice rusty. "Ain't seen you in years." Thor nodded once. "Need to file marriage papers." The judge leaned back, eyes sliding toward Leia. "She willing?" Leia's voice came firm, without tremor. "I am." The judge studied her, then looked back at Thor. "This about trouble?" "It's about stopping it," Thor said. His words dropped heavy as iron. Leaving no room for dispute, the papers were signed in silence. Thor first, then Leia, her hand steady though the ink blotted at the corner of her name. The judge stamped the page, muttering about bureaucrats and late fees, and slid a copy across the desk. When they stepped back into the sunlight, the wind had picked up, kicking dust along the boardwalk. Leia turned her eyes up to Thor. "You going to kiss me?" she asked softly, but serious as stone. Thor's gaze swept the street, then returned to her. "If you want that." "I wouldn't have signed if I didn't," she said. He cupped her cheek, rough hand against smooth skin, and bent low. The kiss was slow, deliberate, steady. No performance, no rush, just truth. When they pulled apart, Leia's hand lingered on his chest longer than necessary, and Thor felt the beat of his own heart hammering against her palm. The ride back to the ridge felt different. Leia leaned into him more, her body not tense now but anchored, her hands resting easy. Thor's chest carried both weight and lightness. He had not expected to feel either again. Back at the cabin, Asha accepted the stamped paper without comment, though something in her eyes softened when Leia laid it in her hands. Nomi peeked over her sister's shoulder, lips parting when she saw the name written clear. Leia Maddox. Later that night, around the table, the stew simmered on the stove, and the air carried a calm none of them had felt in months. Leia's hand found Thor's beneath the table. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. Her fingers spoke more than words could. That night she came to him without hesitation, stepping into the room with lamplight catching her collarbone, her hair loose, her eyes steady. Thor rose from his chair. She reached for his shirt. There were no words, no explanations, only the slow joining of 2 lives that had been running too long. When morning came, she still lay in his arms, her hand warm over his chest. And Thor knew the house no longer belonged to grief alone. Days turned into rhythm again. but it was a different rhythm now. Leia's presence in his bed became as natural as the crackle of the stove or the sound of Asha chopping wood outside. She folded her clothes beside his, stirred the pot when he was late returning from the ridge, leaned her head on his shoulder during quiet evenings by the fire. It was not romance in the way young folk dreamt of it. It was steadiness. It was choice. And for Thor, it was enough. Even Nomi had begun to change. She spoke more freely, her small voice threading through the cabin like a song. She sat with Leia at the table, sounding out words from the battered primer Thor had dug out of a trunk, and each halting syllable carried like a victory. The girl still startled at loud noises, still curled tight when strangers passed on the far ridge. But she no longer looked like she was waiting to run. She looked like she was learning how to stay. One evening, Asha sat across the table, coffee in hand, her eyes steady on Thor. "You meant what you said?" she asked. "I usually do," he answered. "About us being family," she clarified. Thor met her gaze, his voice flat but sure. "I don't say things I don't mean." Asha's jaw tightened, but her voice softened. "I don't want to be owned." "You never were," Thor said. "Not here. Not ever. And no one expects you to be anything but yourself." Her eyes held his a long moment before she looked away. "Just don't want anyone mistaking kindness for permission." "They won't," Thor said simply. Later that night, Leia stood by the window brushing her hair, lamplight catching on her collarbone. The curve of her dress opened just enough to show the swell of her chest. She wore it without shame now, without apology. She turned, eyes meeting Thor's. "You don't look at me like I'm broken," she whispered. "You're not," he said. Her eyes shone. "I thought I was." "You're not," he repeated, stepping closer. She set the brush aside and crossed the floor barefoot, sitting beside him on the edge of the bed. I didn't want to need anyone," she confessed, voice low. "Needing ain't weakness," Thor answered, his hand closing over hers. "Staying's harder than running." She leaned into him then, pressing her forehead against his neck, her breath warm against his skin. "I'm late," she whispered. Thor froze, his hand tightening over hers. "You sure?" She nodded. "Ish. I've counted. And it feels different this time." "I'm not afraid of it, not with you." Thor's chest rose, the weight of the moment pressing heavy. He searched her face, saw no fear there, only steadiness. His voice came rough but true. "Then we'll take it one day at a time." And in that dim room, with the winter wind rattling the shutters and the fire crackling low, Thor Maddox felt the future pressing close, not as threat this time, but as promise. Snow came early that year. By late October, the higher ridges were already dusted white, the wind slipping down sharp enough to cut through flannel and skin alike. Thor Maddox had seen 15 winters on that ridge, each one cruel. But this was the first he did not face alone. The cabin, once hollow as a grave, now breathed with warmth. The stove snapped and popped. Leia's steady movements filled the kitchen. Asha's boots echoed across the porch, and Nomi's soft hum carried from the loft like a thread of life, holding them all together. For a man who had once thought silence was his only companion, it was a revelation. Thor split wood until his arms ached, stacking it high against the wall. He salted venison in the cellar and patched the roof against the storm he knew was coming. But it was not the same kind of labor he had carried before. This time, when he returned from the ridge with his shoulders bent under the weight of the cold, he found Leia waiting by the stove, her hand resting unconsciously on the curve of her belly. This time, When he sat with rifle in hand by the porch, Asha was beside him, her eyes sharp against the tree line. And when the long nights stretched heavy, Nomi's hum carried low in the dark, reminding him that there was still music in the world if you cared to listen. Leia's words from nights past still lingered. "I'm late." She hadn't spoken much more about it, but her hand touched her middle often, absent and steady, as if her body already knew what her mouth hadn't yet said aloud. Thor watched her, a mix of fear and something dangerously close to hope stirring in his chest. He had thought fatherhood burned away with fever years ago. He had thought it buried under ash. Yet here it was again, rising through winter's breath, carried in the eyes of a woman who had chosen to stay. Asha saw it too. She didn't speak of it, but the way her gaze softened when she entered with kindling, the way she stepped back to give Leia space by the fire, told Thor she understood. She had lost as much as any of them, but she carried her grief like a shield. And now, watching Leia, she seemed to accept that new life could root itself even in scarred ground. Nomi began to change most of all. The girl who had once wrapped herself tight in silence now laughed quietly when the mule nudged her shoulder, now read words aloud from the battered primer, her voice halting but stronger with each day. One afternoon she came to Thor in the yard, blankets still clutched around her shoulders, but her eyes clearer than before. "I want to stay," she said, voice low but sure. Thor looked down at her, the weight of her words settling deeper than she could know. "You are," she shook her head, "even if they come." Thor nodded once. "Then they'll have to go through me first." Her lips curved faintly, and for the first time since she'd stepped onto his land, Thor saw a glimmer of what she might become when fear no longer ruled her. The storm hit 2 weeks later, hard and fast, burying the ridge under a blanket of white. Wind howled down the canyon, shutters rattled, and snow seeped into every crack it could find. But inside the cabin, the fire burned strong. They sat together around the table, 4 souls stitched into one life. Asha leaned back in her chair, eyes half shut, voice low. "I don't need papers," she said. "Don't need promises. But if you ever want to make this permanent, I'd stay." Thor met her eyes, his voice quiet but firm. "You already stayed. That's what counts." Leia reached for his hand then, pressing it gently to her stomach. Her eyes were wet, but steady. She didn't speak. She didn't have to. Thor felt it, the truth of what was growing there, and for the first time in years, he let himself smile. Not wide, not careless, but real. That night, as the storm raged outside, Thor lay awake with Leia pressed against him, her breath warm against his neck. He listened to the wind batter the walls, to Asha's steady tread across the porch as she kept her vigil, to Nomi's quiet hum drifting down from the loft. And he realized something he had not dared admit even to himself. The past no longer roared louder than the present. For years, he had lived with ghosts louder than life itself. Now the voices in his house, the sounds of movement, the hum of survival, these had overtaken the silence of loss. When morning came, the ridge was buried, the yard a stretch of white unbroken but for the tracks of deer along the tree line. Thor stepped outside, breath fogging in the cold, and looked out over the land. For the first time in a long while, he didn't see a graveyard of memories. He saw a home, scarred, weather-beaten, but alive. Behind him, through the cabin's thin walls, he heard Leia laugh softly at something Nomi said, and Asha's voice answering firm, but warm. Thor tightened his grip on the rifle, not from fear, but from promise. Whatever storms came, whatever men thought they could claim, he knew now where he stood. With them, for them. Family not born of blood, but forged by choice, by endurance, by the quiet refusal to abandon one another. The storm raged 3 nights before it broke. When the sun finally rose clear, turning the snow to diamonds, Thor Maddox sat on the porch with his shotgun across his knees and the sound of life moving steady inside his home. For a man who had once thought silence was the only truth left to him, it was a revelation. He was not alone. He never would be again. And so the ridge, which had once held only ghosts, carried something new. The sound of belonging, the fire of resilience, and the fragile, steady heartbeat of a family that chose to stay.